Great. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you all very much for being here on a beautiful evening and a Mariners game. We always appreciate you. And tonight's History Café for October is Indian Freedom Fighters in the Pacific Northwest. I'm Sora, I work here at MOHAI. We're happy to have you. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. History Café as a series is presented in partnership with HistoryLink on the third Wednesday of every month. HistoryLink is a wonderful resource as the largest free online encyclopedia of Washington state history. If you need a restroom, they are located through the cafe to the left around the deli case. And a little run of show for tonight. Our speaker, Scott Miller, will give a presentation, and then we'll have a little Q&A, followed by a book signing opportunity. As we ground in the space tonight, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place with lasting impact on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's critical that we hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes and to visit their cultural centers to learn more about the people whose land we're on. Tonight's speaker, Scott Miller, is the author of The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at Dawn of the American Century, and Agent 110, The American Spy Master and the German Resistance. A former foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, he reported from more than 25 countries in Asia and Europe for 2 decades. He's been a contributor to CNBC and Britain's Sky News, and appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He lives in Seattle with his wife, Karen, and a Labrador retriever, Lucy. Tonight, he'll present on his new book, Let My Country Awake, Indian Revolutionaries in America and the Fight to Overthrow the British Raj. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, everybody. Before I start, I have to just address the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's that there is a baseball game going on tonight. Is anybody recording the game? I almost said taping, which would date myself. Is anybody recording the game and hoping to not know the outcome? Okay. So if a phone alert goes out or something, we won't worry about it. So with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, let me just say it's awesome to be able to start this is my first book talks for this book, which hasn't even been released yet. It comes out on October 28th. And because MOHAI was so central to the formation and the origin story of this book, it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, I think, I was looking for a book idea and hadn't really come up with anything that was interesting to me and was interesting, more importantly, to a publisher that might pay me. And I was talking to my agent, this guy named Michael Carlisle at Eatwell Management, and he said, you should do something locally, something from the Northwest or Washington or Seattle. And I thought, that's a good idea. And we hung up. And I started to sort of spin through my brain, what local history seems really important. And the only thing I could think of, I kind of went back to 9th grade when we took a class. I don't know if you all had to do this. There was a class called Washington State History. And it was only half of a school year. The other half was health. And I think nobody really knew too much about it, and I couldn't remember anything from my 9th grade history class about Washington State history. So I went to UW Library and checked out as many books as I could find about the Northwest and Seattle, and was looking for interesting characters. Actually, at one point, I even came across that old TV show, Here Comes the Brides. Does anybody remember that? It was in the Thank you, there's a few of my generation. It was popular in 1968 and 69, and the premise was about these women who came out from, I think, Boston or something to Seattle, and they were going to be school teachers, but hopefully they would also meet husbands here. And it turned out that was kind of a true story, which I had no idea about. There was somebody named Asa Asa Mercer, who actually brought women out to the Northwest. And this is the Mercer of Mercer Island and the Mercer Mess. And he helped found the University of Washington. And it was kind of a cool story, but it really wasn't enough for a book. So Karen and I came down to MOHAI, and we kind of wandered around the upper floors. And the museum was then doing an exhibit about the contribution of Asian Indians to Northwest and Seattle culture. And off in the corner, there was a large, kind of one of the overlarge newspaper. And I always kind of like newspapers and magazines from 100 years ago. I love looking at the ads. You know, it's like, you could buy a shirt for 99 cents. So I went over and took a look at it, and I think this is that's not what the museum had, but I think that's the newspaper. And it was a story from 1907, about when a bunch of Europeans or white people in Bellingham attacked Indian immigrants to that town. And they rampaged through the city and found out where the Indians lived and threw their belongings out on the street and chased them around town. It was a horrible situation. And it succeeded in that the Indians all left Bellingham within the space of about 24 hours. I had never heard about this at all. In fact, I really didn't know that there were very many immigrants from India in the Northwest. I mean, I thought of like Chinese or Japanese or Scandinavians. I mean, I'm a Swede from way back, and we have a Norwegian with us. So I literally stood there and I started Googling on my phone to learn more about this. And I was astounded at all the things that popped up. There was something called the Annie Larson incident, something that was then called the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. And I was like, you know, what? That actually took place in San Francisco, but it was related. There was a bombing in Seattle in 1915. The Indians weren't directly involved, but some of their German friends were, in which a barge of dynamite exploded and blew out thousands of windows in Seattle. People thought Mount Rainier erupted overnight. You know, the boom was so big. And I was, you know, what is going on with all this? And so I went home and discovered that it really was all a continuous narrative, that there was a great story here. And what I always kind of look for when I'm writing a book is, first of all, having a great story. Barbara Tuchman, the great historian writer from the early 60s, she used to write popular history. I think she maybe kind of invented that genre. And she used to say that you have to write so that the reader has to go to the next page, you know, that has to be entertaining. And so, okay, it seemed to fit that bill. But I also kind of like to find something with a bigger truth or a bigger historical importance. And so I started looking around a little bit further and discovered that all this was related to a bigger issue of American immigration. This was at a time of tremendous upheaval in the United States. There were people moving here in record numbers from Europe and Southern Europe, which really hadn't been here before. There was a lot of anxiety about whether people would be able to assimilate, whether the country could absorb all of these people who were coming in. And it all kind of coalesced around this idea called the literacy test, which was really the first attempt by the United States to put together a comprehensive immigration policy. It had been a bit piecemeal before that. There was legislation in 1882 targeting Chinese laborers, and Teddy Roosevelt had arranged a gentleman's agreement to reduce the number of Japanese laborers, but there hadn't been anything that was really comprehensive. And what I learned was this whole dramatic story about Indians and what they were doing here related to this tremendous story of American immigration. It was a tremendously interesting American story, I thought. So I thought what I would do tonight, I also want to call out one person who really helped me with this. When I came up with these ideas and I started reading to see what had been written on this subject before, and there wasn't too much, but there was one in particular, professor at the University of Colorado named Seema Sohi. She got her PhD from UW, and she wrote a book called Echoes of Mutiny that was about this subject, which was an invaluable guide for me when I was starting out. And so when I was pulling together this idea, I wrote her and found her email at the University of Colorado and sent her an email. And I kind of thought, this thing is just going to go into the ether. Probably nobody's going to reply. And if they do, she's going to say, I'm grading papers or at seminars or, whatever academics do. And she replied, yeah, I'll help you. What do you want to know? And it was great. She collaborated with me throughout the project. I talked to her several times and worked on the manuscript and just really helping me with the research and giving me a lot of perspective. So when I got, with Seema's help, and pulled this whole thing together, I did a proposal, a book proposal, which is probably about 40 pages. It takes a fair time to put one of these together. We sent it out to publishers around New York, and we got the usual, no thanks, no thanks. And the publishing industry is actually pretty genteel. Most of the time it's, thank you for your submission. Looks really interesting, but we're going to be going in a different direction. There was one guy at Norton, and I will call him out, and he wrote simply, there is no market for this book. So I was getting a little bit nervous about our ability to sell it, and just kind of out of the blue one afternoon, an editor at Farrar Straus Giroux, which is a unit of Macmillan. I'll give, it takes a quick moment to get that. He phoned up and said he wanted to talk, and we discussed it, and he said, this is the best proposal I've read in years. So I tell that not because I wrote such an amazing proposal, but just to show how sort of capricious, I think, maybe, and arbitrary selling books are. You can have 10 people say, this is the dumbest idea you ever heard of, and then there's one, and that's all you need. And so I was able to sell the idea to them, and then we were off to the races. So what I thought I would do is, rather than try and lay out the whole narrative of the book, there are so many twists and turns that I would keep you here for hours, which would be great fun for me, but I don't know if I could hold your attention that long. So I'm going to kind of highlight 3 vignettes or 3 little episodes from the book and talk about each of those, and that'll, maybe for 20 minutes or so, and then hopefully I'll have some time for some questions afterwards. So kind of the first section I wanted to talk about is the formation of it's actually pronounced something close to Ghadar movement. So I don't know why it is spelled Ghadar. And I've talked about this with people, and that's the way it looks, but it's actually something like the Ghadar movement, which was the Indian Revolutionary movement in the United States right around World War I. And I began the book on Christmas Day in 1912. And I always like to, when I can, take readers when an event happens and kind of place them in something to help locate the reader's attention. Sometimes it's just as mundane as the weather or some news event or something that just kind of embellishes the events of the story. And in this case, on Christmas Day, 1912 in San Francisco, the San Francisco newspapers were full of coverage of a huge party that had taken place in Golden Gate Park. Thousands of school children came and they sang patriotic songs, and it was a beautiful day. The mayor came. And so I began the book with just that little vignette, and then I take readers across the bay to Berkeley, California. And there was a group of Indian students there who were having their own Christmas party. And the star of this event was this guy, Har Dayal. And he was an amazing guy. He grew up in India and was incredibly bright and charismatic. It was said that he could play chess, count the gongs of a bell, recite Arabic poetry, and solve a math problem all at the same time. He had a photographic memory. He could look at a book chapter and then practically recite it. He ended up getting a scholarship to Oxford and went there and apparently was a smash success as a student in every aspect but one. Apparently he was a terrible soccer player, which I don't fault him for that. I'm no good at that game either, but I just thought it was pretty interesting that somebody took the time to oh yeah, great guy, he can't kick. That was actually important. While he was at Oxford, he began to look at British rule of his country in a fairly critical way. Britain, as you know, around this time during World War I and all the way through 1947, ruled India as a colony, and it had done so formally since 1858. And they were pretty nasty rulers. The famous sign, you've probably seen it in movies and things, that they would put on at the entrance to their clubs, no dogs and Indians allowed, just dreadful. There had been an uprising, the Mutiny of 1858, in which Indian soldiers who fought in the British Army rose up against the British, and there's a whole sort of controversy about that we could talk about. And they killed quite a number of British officers, and the Brits put this rebellion down just ruthlessly. They killed tens of thousands of Indians, and one of the ways that they dealt with people that they captured, it was called blown from a gun. They would strap a prisoner over the mouth of a cannon and then fire it. And you can imagine this just spread what remained of the guy everywhere and made burial really difficult. So these sorts of experiences really got to Dayal and led him to really turn on the Brits. He resigned his position at Oxford, which shocked everybody. And he began to sort of travel the world a little bit until he reached the U.S. West Coast around 1911. And because of his amazing personality and charisma and smarts, he got a job at Stanford University, where he was a lecturer. And he was very passionate about achieving India's freedom, but he was also very much into leftist politics, it has to be said. One of the things that he favored was called free love, the idea basically that the institution of marriage was pointless. And you can imagine this did not go over very well with the parents of Stanford University students. And he ended up losing that job, but he developed quite a following around San Francisco. He was buddies with Jack London, the novelist. And he was famous for his Spartan living. He had an apartment in Berkeley with zero furniture, not even a mat, apparently, just one chair for visitors. So he was an incredible guy, and Indian students loved him, and he was the star of this Christmas party. And at the party, he described how a few days before, an Indian revolutionary had thrown a bomb at the British viceroy, who was riding in an elephant in Delhi, of course, riding an elephant. The viceroy was injured but not killed, and Dayal was really stoked about this accomplishment, and the students were as well. And so there was quite a great party and celebration about this. I also kind of wanted to highlight one of the other people who was at the party. this fella, Taraknath Das, who had attended the University of Washington. He was a poli-sci major, and I think that picture is actually out of the UW annual. There weren't a lot of pictures of him from this point, but he was also very much dedicated to achieving India's freedom, and the UW has a whole page about him with his biography, and his story sort of goes throughout my book of all the things that he was doing to achieve India's liberation. This party was such a big success that had everybody talking, and it came to the attention of William Hopkinson, who is in the far right, this fellow here. And he had arrived in Canada by way of India. I think he was probably, his origin story is a bit mysterious. Most people think that he was born in India. Maybe his mother was Indian. He spoke some Indian languages. And he was a cop in India, came to Vancouver and got a job as an immigration inspector. But he was able to sort of transform himself into something of a spy. And he wanted to learn as much as he could about Indian revolutionaries that were then in Vancouver. And he was very inventive and creative. He would apparently sometimes put on a costume, a beard, and go to Sikh temples just to listen to what people were talking about. He would sometimes pretended to be a representative of a logging camp that Sikhs might want to come to so he could, write down their names and learn more about them. And he had a little bit of a spy network, and he very quickly learned about what Har Dayal had said at this Christmas party. And so he came as fast as he could from Vancouver down to San Francisco and to Berkeley and began an investigation about what all these radical Indians were up to and the threat that they maybe posed to the empire. What he found was pretty alarming. It turned out that Har Dayal was not just well plugged in with students, he was also meeting Indian laborers, and particularly Sohan Singh Bhakna. Bhakna's story in the U.S. was very much different from Dayal. He was just a laborer. He'd come here to make money. He had heard from friends that it was fairly lucrative. You could come to the United States, save a bunch of money, and go home. But he encountered a lot of racism here. He once tried to get a table at a restaurant and was refused. And so he sort of pulled together a group of other Indian laborers, mostly kind of in the Portland area, and they were trying to figure out what can we do to improve our situation. Their group really didn't get off the ground very quickly, and when they found out about the charismatic Dayal in the Bay Area, they invited him to come up, and together they found a real synergy, and they decided that they were going to form a new organization that would be called the Ghadar, which is a word for revolt. And one of the things that's kind of most interesting, before I do that, I want to show you this is just a good example of where Indian laborers worked and lived. This is in Astoria, where there were a lot of Indians. They worked in canneries and mills. In this one particular place, there was a barracks that was known as Hindu Alley. A lot of Americans, I think maybe because of the confusion to do with Indians, they described anybody from India as being Hindu, whether they were Sikh or Muslim. There was sloppiness and ignorance, but just everybody was labeled a Hindu. So they formed an organization, Dayal and Bhakna did, and they kind of kicked it off with a big event. These are some Sikh laborers in California. I don't know, I love these old pictures. You can just look into people's faces. The Sikh laborers in California, they worked in mostly in agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. And they actually founded a Sikh temple there. I think it was the first one in the United States, which I was able to visit when I was doing my research. So Bhakna and Dayal, sorry for that little sidelight, but I really like those two pictures. They kind of kicked off their organization at this place called the Finnish Socialist Hall, which was in Astoria. And Dayal gave a speech in front of about 200 people, got them fired up, and got an impressive collection of money. And in the months that followed, the two of them began to travel up and down the West Coast and to logging camps and farms. They visited Indian laborers and collected incredible amounts of money. There was a little bit of suspicion of what they were up to at first, but they won everybody over and raised enough money to go to California, and they set up a headquarters for their organization in the Mission District of San Francisco and began to publish a seditious newspaper, which was also named Ghadar or Ghadar. And they began to plot ways that they might be able to overthrow the Brits. So that kind of sets up the tension of the book, I think. These Indians who were coming together and the Brits starting to learn about them. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the organization was that the Indians put together was that they didn't turn their animosity towards the United States or Americans, and they had ample right to do so. There had been riots and murders of Indians and a lot of violence in California and Oregon and beginning up in Bellingham in 1907. But they really focused on what they could do against the British. And part of that was because I think that at some level they admired the United States and the founding fathers. We had overthrown the British through force of arms, just as they hoped to do. The ideas of liberty, were very inspiring for them. There was one incident, it's kind of famous with Bhakna, where he talks about, he went to try and get a job, and he went to a factory manager in Oregon and said, can I get a job? And the American factory owner said, I would never give you a job. And Bhakna was like, why? Why not? And the factory owner said, how many Indians are there back in India? And he said, 300 million or 250 million. And he said, you mean sheep? You have to go back to India and win your independence. When you do so, come back and I will give you any job you want, but you've got to stand up for yourselves. And Bhakna really took that message. I mean, he repeated it as sort of inspiration and the mission that they had before them. So I'll go on to this sort of the second vignette, but just a little tease. This is a scene from some months later in Vancouver, Canada. And you see it's a funeral procession with a casket. I think it's got the Union Jack on it. And William Hopkinson, the British spy, is inside. The plot thickens. Yeah. So the second event I wanted to talk about is this thing called the Annie Larson affair. It came about shortly after the beginning of World War I, which, as you remember, was sort of kicked off in July and August of 1914. And the beginning of World War I changed everything for the Indians, starting with the Brits, who realized we need every able-bodied person that we can find to come to the Western Front and to go fight the Germans. And so they drained India of all the soldiers that they had there, many of them, and a number of Indian soldiers who were fighting in the British Army. And so this kind of left in the view of the Indian revolutionaries in the United States the perception that, well, India is a bit underprotected. Maybe this is our moment. And so up and down the West Coast, hundreds of Indians, maybe 1,000 in total, began to just sell their belongings. They went into the woods and tried to familiarize themselves with how to shoot guns and how to make bombs. One leader famously blew his hand off trying to make a bomb. And they departed from San Francisco and Seattle to go back to India and try and launch their revolution. I'm not going to talk about that too much. We could, if you like, during question time, but it really sort of kicked off the aggressive part of the Indian revolutionary movement. It also sort of woke the Germans up to an opportunity to wrong foot the British. They thought, oh, if there's these Indians who are so dedicated to achieving their independence, maybe we should give them a little assistance. And maybe that will force the Brits to bring soldiers back to India, or even maybe more importantly, Indian soldiers who were fighting in the Western Front. Maybe they will turn on their British officers. And so they just saw a golden opportunity for creating mischief. And so Berlin sent word to San Francisco for this guy, Wilhelm von Brincken, to make contact with the Indians. And von Brincken is, for my purposes, a spectacular character. He was a German army officer. He was married to supposedly the most beautiful woman in California. She was the daughter of a U.S. senator. He had a ranch in California. Apparently he had a dueling scar. I can't see it in that picture, but I read that he did. And if he did, it just made him look more dashing and, the German army officer with a scar, he looks great. And some of the pictures of him that appeared in the San Francisco newspapers are like this. He's got his hair all slicked back and he's wearing a tuxedo and the guy looks awesome. And best of all, he wanted to be a movie star. And he had been in a movie before World War I and really hoped that he could resume his acting career once the war was over. And I think he really relished the idea of being a spy and working with the Indians. And remember, the U.S. at this point was neutral in World War I. We didn't join that war until 1917. So even though he was German, he had fairly free range to do what he wanted. So he went over to the Indian headquarters. They got their headquarters, where he made contact with Ram Chandra. Chandra had left India with his wife, which was not many immigrants at that time brought their spouses with them. And he first arrived in Seattle. And the two of them got a job at an antique store in Seattle that sold Asian antiques, I guess. And he wanted no part of it. He just wanted to be writing revolutionary literature and plotting. And his wife had to work the floor selling things while he just did his thing. And the couple made no money at all. Apparently they declined to eat meat, and so they apparently lived off peanuts, literally peanuts. And he became so sick at one point that they thought he might die. And he had to be nursed back to health when somebody secretly put meat juice in his broth to try and rebuild his strength. But Chandra and von Brincken hatched an incredibly cool plot. It was really cool, hopelessly complicated, with tons of moving parts. You could see it was headed for disaster from the beginning, but they went ahead with it. So the plan was for the Germans to buy thousands of surplus rifles in the United States, which wasn't particularly difficult. And they would get them out to California, and from there, they had to smuggle them, of course, to India. And they were very worried about British spies who were everywhere. And so they put together this incredible scheme. They created a bogus company with a bogus board of directors, and they bought 2 ships, one of which was called the Annie Larson, which was a decrepit, falling apart sailing vessel. And they thought, if we put all the guns on the Annie Larson, nobody will be suspicious. This thing obviously can't sail to India, and so they'll leave us alone. And their plot was that the Annie Larson would really only go as far as this place, Socorro Island, which is off the coast of Mexico. And there, the Annie Larson would wait, and they would meet a much more seaworthy vessel called the Maverick that the Germans had also bought from the Standard Oil Company. And the plan was to take the guns off the Annie Larson, put them on the Maverick, and then the Maverick would deliver them to India, and revolution would follow. The first part of the plan went hunky-dory. They bought all the guns, they got them out to California, but the British, who just never, ever missed a beat, were onto them. This officer, he was Australian, but he was actually in the Royal Navy, Guy Gaunt. He had raised his hand to begin a British spy network at the start of World War I, moved to New York, and he loved being a spy so much he barely even tried to hide it. He would go to parties in New York, and the hostesses would go, "Oh, look at Guy Gaunt over there. He's a British spy." I mean, he wanted people to know. But he was pretty plugged in, and he figured out that there were all these guns that were going to San Diego, and he began to get suspicious about what was going on. The Germans and maybe the Indians were up to something. So when I was doing research on the book at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and you just see there's just reams of paper from the Department of Justice and immigration officials who were really learned a great deal. They had the exact number of guns and pistols and bombs and everything that got to the Annie Larson, but they didn't know what it was for, and it wasn't necessarily illegal. And the Germans had concocted a great cover story where if somebody found out what they were doing, they were to say, all this is going to Mexico. There's always a revolution going on in Mexico, so we're just going to take it down there. Don't you worry about it. And the Department of Justice kind of just bought this. In fact, it was really funny. There's one memo from the Mexican ambassador in Washington where he goes, we hear that a bunch of guns are headed our way from San Diego. Is there anything you can do? So even the Mexican ambassador was fooled by all this. So the captain of the Annie Larson, he was getting a little bit worried about where everything was going, so he set off for Socorro Island. And he got there, much to the relief of his crew, who I think probably were doubtful that he could actually arrive, that the thing was seaworthy enough. And they got there, and the Maverick was nowhere to be seen. And so they waited and waited, and as you could see, there's really nothing going on in that island, and there's no water. And so the Annie Larson decided, we've got only like a week's worth of water left, and so they left for Mexico to reprovision, and they thought, we'll come back to Socorro Island, and hopefully we'll meet the Maverick there. What they didn't know was that the Maverick was having mechanical problems and was in dry dock in the Bay Area and wasn't even wet. How they didn't know this just baffles me. So the Annie Larson went to Mexico and reprovisioned and set back out to sea, and the poor vessel was so pathetic, it couldn't get back to Socorro Island. And so somehow it just went up the west coast and landed in our own Hoquiam, Washington. This picture's from 1910, but I imagine it probably looked about like that in 1913, 1914. And there was an immigration inspector in Hoquiam who went down into the hold of the Annie Larson, and saw these guns and thought, what is going on here? And he said, we're impounding everything, we're impounding the crew, until we get to the bottom of this, nobody's going anywhere. So in the meantime, the Maverick finally got itself together, went to Socorro Island, and of course, the Annie Larson was nowhere to be seen. It was stuck in Hoquiam. And so the Maverick waited around for weeks at Socorro Island for the Annie Larson, which was never going to come. They finally gave up. They went to California, phoned the German consulate and said, where's everybody? And they said, there's a problem. Why don't you just try to go to India anyway? And there were 5 Indians on board with seditious literature, and I think they thought, well, maybe we can at least deliver that much. They went to Hilo, Hawaii, had a brief stop there, and they got as far as Indonesia. And there the Brits stopped them, got kind of suspicious, basically arrested everybody. The crew scattered. They arrested an American who was one of the American officers. I think the Indians got away, but it was just a catastrophic failure. An example of the Indians and the Germans, really not being able to cooperate. So much time and money and resources were put into it, and it just amounted to nothing. They were undeterred, though, and in the months to come, the Germans and the Indian revolutionaries put together a number of other schemes to smuggle guns and to India and incite revolution, and all of those had sort of similar failures. One of the things that comes through in the book is just British spies were just too good. They were everywhere. They paid off Indians to inform, and they masqueraded as Germans, and they were knocking it out of the park. So it was a really sort of difficult couple of years. I'm yada-yadaing over a lot of the details, but this takes us up to the third and sort of the concluding portion of my talk, the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. Another British spy at this time materialized, a guy named William Wiseman, and he came to New York, set up a spy shop there, and dispatched his number 2, a guy named Norman Thwaites, to the West Coast, who got down to business, and with the help of other spies, I've read that at one point, or over the course of these few years, the Brits had something like 200 spies roaming the West Coast. And they learned about another Indian scheme, and this one involving Chandra Chakravarti. And you see him here with his German pal, Ernst Sakuna. And Chakravarti was a bit of a dandy. He was always immaculately attired. He loved fine dining and kind of the good life. And the Brits discovered that he was being heavily supported by Berlin, and that he might be plotting some sort of bombing scheme in New York or something, and the Brits thought, okay, now we've got him. And they had been very frustrated by the inability or the reluctance of the American Department of Justice or American law enforcement in general to get involved. So they thought, we're going to try a new strategy to see if we can light a fire under the Americans. And so they told Scotland Yard everything that they had learned, and then Scotland Yard told this guy, Thomas Tooney, of the New York Police Department. He was just the way he looks, a sort of a hard-boiled cop, no nonsense. He had seen German bombers and spies around his city, and he took any threat seriously. So when he learned about this guy, Chakravarti, he was all over it. He dispatched some of his men who set up an observation post across from the luxurious house where Chakravarti and Sakuna lived. And they watched him for a couple weeks. They were unable to find anything on him. So they sent a couple of agents to go knock on Chakravarti's door. And their account is pretty funny. They said, we knocked on the door and this little guy answered wearing a loincloth. And we said, where's, what's going on? Where's Chakravarti? And he said, I don't know, I don't know anything. And so the police officers went in. They found Sakuna, they said, reclining on some pillows. They arrested both of them and in relatively short order got confessions from the both of them. And this was finally enough to get the Department of Justice interested. And so they began what would become called the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. It was destined to become the longest and most expensive trial in American history to that point. It was an amazing event. And I kind of wanted to call out Annette Adams. She was the number 2 on the team of American prosecutors. She was one of the first women to graduate from the University of California Law School. And apparently she was just a legal whiz. And she had a tremendous courtroom presence. At some of her trials, women, and she had a very enthusiastic support from suffragettes, which was, of course, very popular movement at this time. Women would go to her trial all decked out in their Sunday best and cheer her on. And she did a lot of the heavy lifting in this case. She was involved in some similar cases involving Germans, and so she was really prepared for this trial and put together charges for what would be, it was something like 40 defendants that the DOJ rounded up, Indians and Germans, and charged them with conspiracy to violate American neutrality laws. It doesn't sound like a very sexy charge, but it was certainly enough to really dive into what everybody had been doing. There's the San Francisco courthouse where it all took place. And I'm going to back up. I'm not going to show you that one yet. The trial was really interesting because the Brits realized, okay, opportunity is knocking. And so they threw everything into helping the Department of Justice prosecute the Indians. They brought many Indian witnesses from India to California. They stashed them away in Canada and then brought them down one at a time when they were needed. A number of British agents came over and set up a headquarters in the British consulate in San Francisco. They conducted their own investigation. They brought out boxes after box of material. Supposedly, British agents even sat with the American prosecution team in the front row in the courthouse to whisper advice about how to prosecute the case. The trial was also noteworthy because there were deep divisions, it has to be said, among the Indian revolutionaries. And it had been kind of building for some time. Ramchandra was very passionate, but he wasn't able to sort of span the divide or the breadth of Indian immigrants who lived in the United States, and he kind of lost their support. A lot of people thought that maybe he was embezzling money that he was getting from the Germans. There were all sorts of accounts of people seeing him with thousands of dollars. There maybe was, I don't think he was up to no good, but he later said that he was actually setting up some secret bank accounts with money that he got from the Germans, not because he wanted to live the high life, but because he wanted to build a new headquarters for the movement in San Francisco. And he was afraid if he told people about it, that would lead to infighting and whatnot. But it really only just kind of weakened his case. So as the trial went on, there were lots of accounts of Indian defendants, criticizing each other. Chakravarti, who was providing evidence against them, was particularly unpopular. The German consul general was particularly pissed off about the whole thing. One time when Chakravarti was in the courthouse, the German diplomats, yelled at him, "You're ruining it for everybody, just stop." But the case proceeded, and it was a huge sort of national spectacle. I mean, it had everything that you would want from a cool trial. It had spies and Germans and Indians, and it got tons of coverage, as you can see here in the New York Tribune. And I don't want to spoil the outcome of the book, so I'll just kind of flick at this. But on the final day of the trial, one of the Indian defendants smuggled a pistol into the courtroom. And just as the judge was telling the jury to go consider the evidence you've heard and bring back a judgment, the pistol came out. So just very quickly, there's some coverage of what happened. But I've shown you too much already. So, so I'm just going to tease you with that. So that's not the whole book, but I think it kind of gives you a flavor of what's going on and some of the main characters and kind of how I approached it. So I think we probably have a couple of minutes. I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Sir.
Did your research take you to documents and similar things in India itself? How did the Indian press and the Indian movement cover this? Because I know there was a similar thing in World War II with Subhash Chandra Bose leading collaboration with the Japanese and raising money. So I'm curious, what was the press coverage and archives within India itself?
I didn't go to India itself for this. A lot of the correspondence, at least from the British side, that of events that took place in India is now held in London at the National Archives in Kew and at the British Library. So there's quite a bit there. I talked with Seema Sohi about that, and we concluded that there wasn't probably, so much of my book took place in the United States, and I unapologetically say I was trying to write an American story. This is a great India story, no doubt, but my take on this was, what did it mean for the United States? And so I really kind of focused on that. Doing the research for the book, I went to Berkeley. They have a tremendous collection of South Asian documents and oral histories, and they at Berkeley, and they are really good. The National Archives in San Bruno, San Francisco, has a lot about the trial itself. And I spent a lot of time in D.C. at the National Archives in College Park, and also in Washington. I went up to Yale because the Wiseman papers, even though he's a Brit, his papers weirdly are at Yale, and Library of Congress, and then these two big places in India. So those are my primary research places.
You mean London?
Did I say, what did I just say?
Said India.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. London. Yes. Yep. Sir.
I had a similar question, but maybe more from the American perspective. Was there any leanings of the American public and the government, especially before the U.S. entered World War I, on the Indian Revolution movement? Were they in favor of it? Were they against it? Was it complete neutrality? What was that perspective before the U.S. kind of joined?
That's a great question. I was kind of hoping that somebody would ask that. There's kind of two parts to that question. There was the issue of Indian immigration, and there was a lot of anxiety about it. And not just Indians, but South Europeans were arriving, and there was just a lot of anxiety in the United States about immigration in general. So you read a lot about ordinary Americans and labor unions saying, we've got to keep these Indian laborers out of the country. They're taking jobs, and they'll never assimilate with American culture. Very, arguments that we have heard through the decades. As far as the revolutionaries themselves, there was a significant portion of the American public and the American government who supported them. William Jennings Bryan, who was the Secretary of State during the first part of first part of World War I, was very pro-Indian. He had visited India and written about how awful the British were, and the Brits were really frustrated at the refusal of people like him to really help them in chasing down revolutionaries. There were church groups that were very pro-Indian, and there was also kind of before this time, and one of the things I put in the beginning of the book that I think was really interesting was there was a kind of a general interest in Indian culture in the years before. I did a little sort of TikTok video about it. America's first celebrity chef was an Indian curry chef who came to New York and became a real celebrity. And nobody knew anything about it. I read a review of his restaurant in the New York Times where they were like, what is this curry stuff? And they described sitting down. They said, we're actually afraid of the menu. We don't know what's on it. But it was so popular. And he actually became kind of a celebrity. He traveled around the country. And of course, Indian religion, there was a lot of interest in that. I think it was one of the church leaders in Boston joked, and this is probably like the 1880s, I think, where he said, I've got to go to India because all of my parishioners are going there. That's all they care about. So there was a sort of a tremendous interest in Indian culture. And of course, American writers were very interested in Indian society. And I think that was part of the attraction of Har Dayal, who I first mentioned. Here was this guy from exotic India, was the way he was seen, and people wanted to learn about it. He was lecturing on Hindu philosophy, and people were really eating it up. So it was a little bit of both, I think. There was a lot of, among educated Americans in particular, there was tremendous interest, but there was also this fear about, and it wasn't specific to India, but just we're going to be swamped with 300 million people could be entering the country and take our jobs, was the thinking. Yes?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for doing this talk. I was curious about how you were able to use intelligence agency or spies, those kinds of sources. I feel like there's a lot of propaganda and there's a lot of, people might inflate the threat of, foreign subversion, but at the same time, Germans really did, want to, fight against the British.
Yep.
So how were you able to verify the veracity of these kinds of sources?
You kind of just did what you could. You tried to collaborate it, and you also had to be aware, and that was one of the hazards of researching the book, is there's tons of documentation, but it's written by people with a dog in the fight, particularly the Brits. Their reports, their espionage reports, are all day by day. They're laid out in London, and they're really detailed. And so you kind of would, okay, this is interesting. They say this happened on this date. I'll see if I can collaborate this with maybe some other accounts. And I think, a lot of it was, I think it was largely accurate, but you just had to be very aware that this was written by spies, and, it was kind of basic historical research. Everybody had an opinion, and you kind of had to be aware of what they were coming from, what they were trying to do with these reports. But that was certainly one of the challenges.
Hi. So I was fortunate enough to read one of the advanced copies that's floating around the museum. So thank you. Awesome book.
Great, thank you.
This goes back to the previous question. I remember you mentioning that there were a lot of Irish people descended from Irish immigrants who also had a beef with the British, so I was just curious if that was part of the public opinion in America.
Yeah, that was certainly one of the problems for the Americans, and I think part of their reluctance to dive in was, that the U.S. had a lot, at that time, a tremendous percentage of Americans had German blood in them, and the Irish in particular were a very strong ethnic group, and they really argued their corner, and they hated the Brits every bit as much as the Indians did. And they tried to cooperate and help just as much as they could. When, in the Annie Larson incident, when the guns were being transported, a lot of them were purchased on the East Coast, the Germans turned to friends who were Irish and were sympathizers with them. And it was an Irish-owned railroad company that they shipped a lot of the guns to California on. In the trial itself, the attorneys, a lot of them were financed by Irish money. Dayal, who I mentioned early on, he ended up being arrested and he posted bail, and the person who paid for his bail was sort of an unknown Irish woman. He ended up skipping on the bail, so I don't know if she ever got her money back or how they arranged that, but they were very supportive of the Germans and of the Indians throughout. And then there was one Irish priest in San Francisco, and I didn't know this, but San Francisco had a very strong Irish community. I kind of always thought Boston or places like that, but there was even, I could be wrong about this, but I think maybe San Francisco was the first place to have an Irish mayor, something like that. And there was an Irish priest who did everything he could to assist the Germans and the Indians in sort of setting up communications between the two. One of their meeting places for the Indians and the Germans was at an Irish bar in San Francisco. So there was a lot of secondary encouragement from Irish, yeah.
What is the backstory behind your title?
Oh, great question. I was inspired to, and along with my publisher, to use that title, Let My Country Awake, and it was taken from a poem from an Indian poet, Rabindranath Tagore, who in 1913 won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the first non-European to win that Nobel Prize. I'm not sure if it was any Nobel Prize or the Nobel Prize for Literature. Anyway, he was one of the first ones. And he wrote a book of poetry, and some of it was about Indian oppression and how he wished that they would be able to achieve their independence from Britain. Kind of the interesting thing about him was the revolutionaries in California thought he was, even though he wrote critically about British rule, they thought that he was maybe a little bit too close to the Brits. And in fact, he was awarded a knighthood in 1915, which he accepted. And this kind of did not sit well with some revolutionaries. And he traveled to the U.S. in 1916 and became embroiled in a little bit of a controversy with some of the people I've talked about who kind of tracked his movements. There were rumors that he might be attacked. It turned out that it was fine, and it's possible that the British were there stirring the pot, and I think they assigned bodyguards to him in order just to make the revolutionaries look bad. And anyway, the title was taken from one of his Nobel Prize-winning poems.
Hi, in the photo that you showed of Sohan Singh Bhakna, he's together with some other men and they're all chained together. What's going on in that photo?
Great, I should have mentioned that. That photo, I couldn't find very many good photos of him, and that one is from 1938, I think the 30s. And he actually survived this. He was one of the ones who went back to India, as I was talking about. He got arrested. He didn't even set foot in India. The Brits were waiting for him. His ship pulled in, to a harbor off the coast of India. They went on board and gotcha. And so he was originally sentenced to death. They later reduced that sentence, and he was kind of in and out of jail for quite some time after that. And I'm really glad you brought that up. I forgot to mention that. And so that picture was taken sometime later. I don't know who the other guys are, but that was really one of the few good photos I could find of him. And crucially, one of the photos that I could actually get permission to use, which is always helpful.
I'm just curious. Oh, go ahead.
Oops.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Hey, Scott, mine's an adjacent question. Are you going to write the Wikipedia page, or has it been written? And if so, are you going to edit it?
I have some Wikipedia. I have never done anything on Wikipedia. I was kind of astonished that I even have a profile on it. I think some publisher put that up. It's horribly out of date, and there's references to some of my other books about McKinley and from the second book, Agent 110, and I just have never got involved with Wikipedia. I suppose I should from a marketing standpoint and just to get myself out there. That's a really good question, and I should put that high on my to-do list, but I just have never dived into to Wikipedia. But.
That was my question.
Are you serious? Wow.
I know from experience that primary source research is usually a long process with a lot of lag and then some exciting bursts. So was there a point in your research where you found like an especially exciting document?
There was, it's funny because with Seema's book, she did so much great research, and I was following in her footsteps for a lot of it. She spent time in Canada. I found digitalized versions of some of the stuff that was in Canada. But there were a couple of, you wouldn't even notice them in the book, but things I found in London. There was one where I think it was a comment from the Brits after the trial in which the Indians were found guilty. And the penalties they received weren't severe, but there was a comment from the Brits who said that the jail time isn't severe, but we think this thing is broken. This was a huge success for us. I hadn't really seen that before, really linking the outcome of the trial to British intelligence. So that was one. And then there was another, one of the things that I was never able, that I found, but going into it, that I wasn't really able to satisfy myself with was what prompted the Department of Justice to actually launch its investigation. And they did it like almost simultaneously with the US entering World War I. And it had kind of, in the things like the secondary material, it made it sound like there was a connection. And I think that it was primarily because there was a trial before that in which some of the same Germans who were in this trial were charged with some bombings around the United States. And the Department of Justice actually won that. And there is a comment from Charles Warren, who was the assistant U.S. Attorney General. He said, okay, we got the Germans. Now I expect you, and he's writing to the prosecution, his team in San Francisco, I expect you to go out and get the Indians. Let's go do it now. And I hadn't really seen that before, so that really helped with, just with me, with the timing of how this unfolded. I know this is really nitty-gritty and kind of in the weeds, but for me, when I saw these two things, they were definitely eureka moments when I was doing research, and both of those happened to be in London. Anybody?
So I was curious, it hadn't occurred to me when I was reading the book, but when you were telling the story about the hotel room and the loincloth moment, like, and the photograph of the two of them, like, I wondered, they were living together? Is there any intimation of a relationship there?
I don't know. It's probably. There's nothing to support that, but they were good buddies for a long time. I don't know the status of their relationship. I think that they did live together. That's all I could say. But it was natural for Chakravarti. He was tight with the Germans at that point, and so it was natural that he would have some German friends. I think he spoke German. So, but I don't know about that relationship. I did wonder about it, but I couldn't find any documentation, yay or nay. So.
Did you find any evidence of historical memories amongst the Indian American communities of this and their involvement?
I was very interested in that when I started my research and visited people primarily, also Sikhs and Hindus, and to find out what they thought about this, and do you even know about this movement? And I got varying replies. One of the places that I went to was the Sikh temple in Stockton, California, and they have the printing press that this newspaper, or a printing press, there were a couple, they have that kind of stored at the temple. And I talked to a fellow there who was a historian. He was very up on all this. I talked to the Whatcom County executive, who's a Sikh, and he's very up on the riot that took place in Bellingham in 1907. In fact, he's going to join me on a little radio show in Bellingham, the Chuckanut Radio Hour. And I asked quite a few people about it and got really a range of replies. Maybe sort of older people. I went to the Sikh temple in Vancouver, which was mammoth, and they were so welcoming. They gave Karen and I a tour of the place, and they told us about the Komagata Maru incident, which took place there. We brought our dog, Lucy, and they watched her while we went around. And kind of to my astonishment, a couple weeks later, I got home and I got a phone call from some guy up there, and he said, "Oh, did you know that you're in the newsletter for the Sikh community in Vancouver?" And there, Karen and I and Lucy were, in the newsletter, and they were writing about my interest in this subject. So, I don't know. That's a very long-winded and not very clear answer to your question, but I think it varies. Let's put it that way. We good? Does anybody want to know the baseball score? No. Not want to know? Okay. You've spoken.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott. Please, everyone, give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you.